You've heard of Stonehenge, but have you heard of Newgrange? Newgrange is a Neolithic burial site in modern day Ireland. And I'll talk about Newgrange later in the video. But have you also heard of Jericho? Jericho is one of the earliest human settlements, which we will look at in this video. Or what about the Turkish site Çatalhöyük? This is one of the first really permanent, organized human settlements. Maybe we would think of it as like the first city, although it's not really a city. In this video, we're going to look at the Neolithic era. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Devon, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Devon, and this is Art Trippin. So what does Neolithic mean? Remember that lithos is stone in Greek and neo is new. So the Neolithic period refers to the new Stone Age, in contrast to the Paleolithic. So one of the major differences between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic eras was the development of agriculture and animal husbandry. So it cannot be emphasized enough how this changed from a more nomadic lifestyle, a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, to a farm-based culture that collects and stores food and stays in one location to take care of the animals and to harvest that food. It cannot be overstated how much this changes the way people live and the way people create art. Now, first of all, when you're not constantly moving and you're staying in one place for a long time, you have time to develop the arts. As you're waiting for your crops to grow, waiting for your animals to grow so that you have a food source, you have time to develop pottery, textile, and other art forms. Because people are now able to store food for later use and ensure a more sustained and predictable food supply, the labor of these people could be divided into more specialized skills that reflected the demands of their community. So what we will see in the Neolithic period is the beginning of organized community living. We will also see, tied to that, is the development of monumental architecture. So people are staying in one place, they're growing food, they're raising animals, and once they stay in a place long enough, they finally have time to build permanent structures to live in. And also we will see the beginnings of what we might call in our modern era religion or ritual practices related to spirituality. So we will begin soon to see the first temples, and we will begin to see the development of death rituals. We'll start to see ritualistic burials and objects being buried with the deceased. Some of the earliest Neolithic communities known are found in what we might today call the ancient Near East. So this includes parts of present-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And we find a concentration of these settled communities in this area because this region was incredibly fertile. There were lots of major rivers crossing through here. There are lots of native plant species that were easily domesticated, namely wheat and barley. And so culture developed alongside the development of agriculture and animal husbandry in the Neolithic era. It is during this time period in the ancient Near East that we see the first development in the West of weaving or textile production, metalworking, and pottery. And all three of these technologies require knowledge and skilled labor and natural resources to produce the end products. This knowledge would then be passed down through generations, as would the proper tools and skills. So this really is, for art historians, this really is sort of the beginning of culture. This is when we start to see objects that we would now call art. In this video on Neolithic art, we're gonna look at 4 major sites: Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Stonehenge, and Newgrange. So let's start with Jericho. Jericho is one of the earliest Neolithic communities. This is built on a plateau in Jordan near modern-day Palestine. There is a spring located nearby that would provide a reliable source of water. And this village grew from a small village of huts into a 10-acre settlement by 8000 BCE. And by 7500 BCE, they had built a huge wide ditch and 5-foot thick walls that were constructed to protect the settlement. So there is a sense of fortification of the settlement, which means that they felt the need for defensive walls. So we see the beginning of defensive architecture, like a prototype for the castle. One of the famous structures at Jericho is the Great Stone Tower that's 30 feet high with an opening at the top and a stairway that leads to the bottom. We don't really know what was stored inside of this tower, probably grain or something like this, but it is a really tremendous technological achievement at the time, so early in the Neolithic period. Here we can see this great stone tower, perhaps a granary of some sort, some kind of storage for food. Perhaps it has a defensive purpose, this kind of wall to protect from marauding nomads. But anyway, we see the beginning of monumental stone architecture here at Jericho. At Jericho, we also see the beginnings of some of the first evidence of funerary practices. We see that they placed importance on honoring the dead. If people are not constantly moving and hunting, trying to get out of icy situations and whatnot, they have time to develop rituals around their spiritual beliefs and to make objects that we might today call art to be used in those rituals. So one example, it's a little creepy, but I love creepy stuff, is this human skull with restored features. This is from Jericho, dating to about 7200, 6700 BCE. This is an actual human skull that has been modeled and plaster has been applied to sort of build up the facial structure again, and then it has been painted and the eyes have been inlaid with shells. And so this is sort of like an attempt to reanimate the face of the deceased. So again, this is an early example of death rituals and practices related to the spiritual beliefs of Neolithic people around death. We also see human figures. They're about 3 feet tall, plaster human figures, also from Jordan. We don't know the original purpose of these objects, but some of the ideas that scholars have thrown around include grave markers. These were found at grave sites, so they might have marked the grave of individuals. Perhaps these were animations of spiritual guides that would lead people into the afterlife. Maybe these are portraits of the deceased. Now, you can see this is a full figure form with some painted eyes. We believe that there were other parts of the face painted on, like the mouth, and then there is some evidence that these actually had clothing on them. There are remnants of textiles that have been found on these human figures, so perhaps they actually wore clothing. And because of this, some scholars have even speculated that these might have been an early version of a doll. These were constructed of reed and twine frames, and then they were sort of bundled up and covered with plaster. It's almost like a Neolithic paper mache process. They would have originally been painted, decorated, and clothed. And so when we look at them now, we don't see any identifiable gender markers, but this may have been indicated by their garments, which have since deteriorated. And because they were found in burials, we assume that they had some kind of ritual purpose. Now, let's head to stop 2, Çatalhöyük, We are in modern day Turkey, and this site is really fascinating because this is one of the earliest Neolithic settlements, something that we might consider almost like a modern day city. This is dated to about 6000 BCE, and here we're looking at an artist's rendering. So this is a reconstruction of what this place might have looked like. If you look at this image, you can see that it's built close to a river or spring, a source of fresh water. You will also notice that there are no windows. And in fact, the residences and the structures were entered from above. So you would go up a ladder and then enter down from the roof, from the top. So the idea of like not having windows is a form of defensive architecture. It's the same thing that you will see on a medieval castle, that there are few or no windows to provide defense for the people inside. So there's evidence at Çatalhöyük of animal husbandry, so the keeping of and raising of animals for food purposes. We also see what are perhaps the first temples at Çatalhöyük. We also see rooms for storage of grains and other foodstuff. We also see evidence of pottery making and textile production. Here we're looking at a reconstruction of an interior. So you can see that the interior of the residences would have been plastered over. They would have laid reed mats on the floor, and the door is in the roof to help protect from siege. We also see some of the first shrines. There are depictions both of bulls and of voluptuous women found at this site that may have been shrines or temples or some kind of place for ritual actions related to spirituality. Beyond that, we don't have hard and fast facts. These are sort of speculations. Even though farming and animal husbandry was well established, people still hunted. And this is made evident in paintings that have been found here that depict humans in the act of hunting. So here we see a depiction of a deer hunt from 5750 BCE. Now, one of my favorite objects is this landscape painting that was found on the wall here at Çatalhöyük. This is dated to about 6150 BCE. I love this because this might be a big first. We don't know for sure, but if we are right, this could be the first landscape painting in the Western tradition. And depending on what you think is depicted here, it might be the first narrative or historical painting in the Western tradition. Now, here you can see a partial reconstruction of the settlement. And if you look at it next to this painting, you can see that perhaps this painting is a map or a depiction of the city, what we would today call a landscape painting. A landscape painting is a painting of a natural setting or a location as its subject matter. So perhaps these black rectangular shapes may represent the structures of the town. And then this orange thing in the background could represent a nearby volcano, a volcanic mountain. So if this is how you're reading the image, then perhaps this is one of the earliest landscape paintings in the Western tradition. Now, some scholars believe that this is a narrative or historical painting. We see this twin-peaked burnt orange shaped object in the background that could be a volcano. And this volcano appears to be in the process of erupting. So therefore, this would depict a specific historical event. So here we see at Çatalhöyük the really early development of painting, including depictions of humans in the act of hunting, depictions of bulls, and depictions even of places or landscape paintings. Now, let's glide across Europe and head to Northern Europe and look at monumental architecture in modern day England and Ireland. I'm talking namely of the sites of Stonehenge and Newgrange. So we're going to see that megaliths big giant stones, and henges are significant to Western European cultures, and they're really important in early Neolithic architecture. So we're going to see these structures built based on two basic concepts of architecture, the post and lintel system, which I mentioned in the first video, Introduction to Prehistoric Art. And we will also see the use at Newgrange of the corbelled vault. A corbelled vault is formed by piling stone or rocks in a horizontal cantilevered pattern so that they cantilever inward until the two walls meet in an arch. So literally just like putting some rocks and putting the next rocks to hang over a little bit, and that you keep going until you create this kind of pointed A-shape arch. Let's start with Newgrange. Newgrange is a Neolithic tomb located in Boyne Valley, County Meath, Ireland. And this is an area that in the modern era is often referred to as the Valley of the Kings because of the numerous Neolithic tombs in the region, but Newgrange kind of is the star of the show. Newgrange is a large mound tomb that dates to about 3200 to 2500 BCE. So you can see that we've gone forward quite a bit in our timeline, and it is a large mound tomb that sort of imitates the form of the mountain, and it's kind of in a valley where there are grass-covered rolling hills, and some of these tombs really blend into the rolling hills, and inside are hidden burial chambers, probably for the elite members of society at the time. These mound graves were often tied to natural phenomenon like the movement of the sun, and these funerary practices were often related to what in our modern day we would call astronomy. So Newgrange is the perfect example for this. On the morning of the winter solstice, at the sunrise, the sun rises and shines directly through a little window over the opening of Newgrange, and it shines light directly into the interior burial chamber. So this building is literally aligned with the winter solstice. This means that ancient people had an understanding of the solstices, the equinoxes, the movement of the heavenly bodies. Now, if you've watched any of my videos, you know I am an avid traveler, and I have been really lucky to go on these, I call them art pilgrimages, to see some of these sites. So I have been lucky enough to visit Newgrange. You have to reserve because it's like always booked, especially in the summer, but honestly any time of year you should reserve ahead of time, because if you just show up you probably won't get in. You have to go on a tour. So you arrive at the like interpretive center, and then they take you on a little bus, and you arrive at this green field. You can see the sheep wandering around, and you see this monumental building with this kind of stone wall all around it. But otherwise it really blends into the natural landscape. You see it kind of blending in with the hills, and the grass has grown over it. As you approach closer, you see these huge megaliths, these big stones that have these spiral designs carved all over them. Now, we don't really know what these spiral designs mean, but in general, spirals often refer to the concept of infinity, which would make sense if you believe that people were practicing some kind of ritual here related to a concept of an everlasting life or an afterlife, a way that life continues after death. Then you walk into this, and it is not for the claustrophobic. And I got a little bit of panic and anxiety as we went in here. We walk into this narrow hallway. It's really like one at a time, single file. You can see this corbelled vault that they use. The walls are kind of slanted above you, so there is a sense of sort of compression as you're moving through this narrow passageway, just like a cave. cave. So you remember from the Paleolithic video, we talked about going through the cave and then it opening up into this kind of cathedral. In the same way, you're going through this narrow passageway. Maybe it's like the birth canal, and then it opens up into this vast space. Now, it's not as huge as a cave. When I was there, I think we had maybe like 15, 20 people. It's a small room compared to a cave, but it does open up to a really high ceiling. And inside here, this is where we would see the burial. This is where we would find large trays and the bones would have been placed on there. We can see also in the interior here, this corbelled vaulting. It's formed by the piling of stones and blocks on top of each other in this horizontal course, and they're sort of cantilevered inward until they meet at the top. And then, as I mentioned earlier, on the sunrise on the winter solstice, the sun shines as it rises. It shines right in through a little window. So it's not even the main door, but it's like a little bit of a window above the door, and the light shines right in and illuminates the interior, the burial chamber. I have not been able to see it on the winter solstice. I have applied many times to the lottery. You put your name in a lottery, and only so many people can see this every year because it's a small burial chamber. Only so many people, 15 or so people, are allowed inside at a time. And, you know, the solstice just happens once a year. So every year there's a lottery. So if you want to go see this, keep putting your name in that lottery to go to the Newgrange sunrise on the winter solstice. Now, an easier site to visit because, well, frankly, you can see it from the road, is down the way in England at the very famous site of Stonehenge. So here we are in our last stop on our Neolithic journey, looking at an aerial view of Stonehenge, which is on the Salisbury Plain in England. This site is dated to about 2500 or 1500 BCE. This circle is 97 feet in diameter, and these large stones, some of them are 24 feet tall. So a henge is a sacred enclosure, usually comprised of a circular bank and then a ditch. And these are really found throughout the British Isles. This one was begun around 3000 BCE, and in fact, there is an older timber version, so a version made out of wood, down the way. And so there's some evidence that people were participating in processions where they're walking from one site to another. And this structure was actually worked on continuously for centuries. So it evolved perhaps as the people who used it evolved how it was used. In its day, the construction of Stonehenge was an impressive engineering feat. It required commitment, time, and a vast amount of manual labor. So this implies some kind of organized power structure, and it was believed that the ditch was dug with tools made from antlers of red deer and possibly wood. And the stones themselves come from 150 miles away. So what we see today are the remnants of a site that took a great deal of time, energy, and resources to build. So who built Stonehenge? It's really still unclear. It's definitely not the Druids. Stonehenge had been around for 2,000 years before the time of the Druids. And anyway, Druids worshipped in the forest, so they didn't really have a need for ritual architecture. But this was probably built by local indigenous people who were living in this area and using this for some kind of ritual purpose, the details of which are simply still unknown to us. So, what do you think? How do you think Stonehenge was used? Do you think that people were worshiping here? And what about Newgrange? Do you think that people were worshiping the dead or simply burying the dead? What kinds of rituals might they have been practicing here? Let me know in the comments. And as always, if you like this video on Neolithic art and architecture, make sure to give us a like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more Art Trippin' with Prof D, the lecture series.